Hi, thanks for joining us this afternoon. We are all living through a moment of historically large disruption. We emerged from a global pandemic only to see a land war erupt in Europe when Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an aggressive revisionist China seeking to stretch its might across the globe, and a new leader here in the U.S. who seeks to revise, perhaps dramatically, the U.S.'s role in the world. Every year, the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zürich explores big global trends. This year, the stakes are high and the analysis is hard-hitting. This year's Strategic Trends examines shifting Eurasian partnerships, conflicts in the Middle East, deepening Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific cooperation, digital assets and capabilities, and the role of critical technologies in great power competition. I'm Emily Harding. I run the Intelligence National Security and Technology program here at CSIS, but let me introduce our fabulous panelists. First of all, we have Dr. Daniel Möckli, head of the think tank, the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zürich. Danny previously was the head of policy planning at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, overseeing strategy development and geopolitical analysis. He worked on security and peace policy at the Secretariat General of the FDFA. And between 2013 and 2017, he was diplomatic advisor to Foreign Minister Didier Burkhalter, with a particular focus on Switzerland's OSCE presidency in 2014, and of course its response to the unfolding crisis in and around Ukraine then. His PhD dissertation, which I admit I have not read yet, but someday, covered the beginnings of European foreign policy cooperation from 1969 to 1974, which means you have seen Euro-Atlantic security cooperation as a scholar and as a practitioner over nearly 50 years of research. Also, he knows all the best places to hike around Zurich. That's just a personal note. Then we have Dr. Gorana Grgić, senior researcher, Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at CSIS. Gorana is a non-resident senior lecturer at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney, so already spanning the globe, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center. She has contributed at NATO Defense College, Harvard Center for European Studies, and the University of Western Australia, and her research interests include US and EU foreign policy, transatlantic relations, conflict resolutions, and democratization, so all the big topics. She's also a recipient of multiple teaching awards for teaching excellence and innovation, which is not an easy thing to do, so bravo. And then we have two guests joining us online. First of all, we have Dr. Myriam Dunn Cavelty, senior scientist and deputy for research and teaching at CSIS. She is an associated researcher at the Center for Advanced Security Theory at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, was a visiting fellow at Brown, a Mercator Fellow at the University of Darmstadt, Germany, and a guest lecturer at the Central European University, Hungary, and the Austrian Federal Security Academy for several years. Is there anywhere in Europe where you have not worked yet? I think you need to complete the chessboard. Her research and teaching focuses on how digital technologies influence political behavior and societal values. She advises governments, international institutions, and companies in the areas of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, critical infrastructure protection, risk analysis, and strategic foresight, and she is one of the editors-in-chief of the journal Contemporary Security Policy. And then finally, we have Névine Schepers, team head, senior researcher, Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team. She's the co-editor of the monthly policy brief, CSS Analyses in Security Policy. She's a member of the European Leadership Network's Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security, more briefly, YGLN, and a mentor for the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium Young Women in Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Mentorship Program. We certainly need more of that. She worked at IISS and Vertic on non-proliferation and security policy, and her areas of research include nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament, and deterrence issues. So a terrific panel with a truly global reach. This group of people has shaped policy from DC to Sydney to London to Singapore, and you sit now at the center of Europe in a time of intense change. So let's talk through this really quite comprehensive and, as I said, hard-hitting report about these massive disruptive trends going on right now. Danny, let's start with you. I know you want to say a few words about the great work that you're doing at CSS, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having us. It's really appreciated that we have the opportunity to present what's perhaps quite a European perspective on some key developments in global affairs. So the Center for Security Studies we're all working at is ETH-based. It's a center that combines academic research and think tanking, policy consultancy. So really take a broad approach to security. We combine security and peace studies. And I would say it's a scientific-based think tank, scientific-inspired think tank. Strategic Trends, which is mainly edited by Gorana, my colleague here, is the international flagship product. But we do have quite a lot of different products where if people are interested, you can get a bit of a European, perhaps even Swiss flavor in analysis of security and peace issues. So I just encourage everyone to check our website and see what we are doing there. So I would also like, before we perhaps go into the chapter, mention we have two more chapters, two authors who are not with us today. One is by Michael Singh from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I know that he's a bit of house friend here too. He did a chapter on the Middle East, and we have a piece by Professor Jeronim Perovic. He's an associate of the CSIS. He's professor at the University of Zurich, and he does a piece on Russia and Eurasia. So it's the six of us, but I think the four of us, we're very glad that we can talk about our topics today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being here. And yes, Mike's an old friend of mine, and I was excited to see his chapter as well. And the whole report, it really is comprehensive. It goes regional, it goes functional, it's got tech in there, it's got a little bit of everything for everybody. But your chapter really is a big overview of these trends. A rudderless world, which is such an image. American neo-revisionism and the demise of the global order. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, that is a stark warning. So you highlight this growing trend of revisionism among countries. What implications should we see coming out of this US shift in the future of the Western-led global order?
Yeah, so I mean, the main theme of the whole product here is we coined it navigating fractures and uncertainties. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that what we in the West have coined liberal international order is really in full demise now. It has been eroding for quite a while. We wrote several years ago already about these developments, and there has been Russian and Chinese revisionism that we all know about, and indeed the former editor of Strategic Trends discussed with you here 2 years ago, Brian Carlson, the nuances and the differences between Beijing's and Moscow's approach to revisionism. And what's really new, I think the game changer, is that with the Trump administration, there's now all major powers at the same time revisionist when it comes to order. That's quite rare in history. That has quite a strong impact. I mean, the US, again, you could argue there has been moments of discontent and rupture with the global order, perhaps ever since the Iraq War. But I do think that it is still the revolution that we are witnessing now in foreign and trade policy. It's really a rupture that goes beyond what we've seen before. Also with the Trump one, which was about doing deals, transactionalism more within a system. And now I think it goes beyond the system. It does so but because of domestic change, but I also read these developments in the US as perhaps an early, very turbulent beginning of strategically repositioning the US in an emerging multipolar world. So at the moment, I mean, people say there are authors who suggest we're moving towards a concert order with the three major power spheres of influences. I don't think we are there yet. I don't think the bilateral dynamics of the respective relationships between these three countries point to that. But we really don't know at the moment where we are heading. And Harari, the Israeli historian, Yuval Noah Harari, he coins this the post-liberal global disorder. It's a bit harsh, but I think we all know what he's getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about getting the view from Europe and this being a Europe focus. What is Europe seeing happening across the Atlantic? What sort of tea leaves are you reading that is showing you the direction you think the US is headed?
So from a European perspective, I mean, I'm arguing in the chapter that we don't know where we are heading, but what happens in the regional struggles for order will be one of the decisive elements in how the world will be governed, whether it's Europe, the Indo-Pacific, or the Middle East. And we cover some of this in different chapters. And in Europe, at the moment, you have the position that it's the last sort of defendant of a liberal order, together with some non-European liberal allies. It is investing a lot into security and defense because of growing uncertainties about the US security guarantee. It also has fragile democracies. It is a scenario that there will be post-liberal social change in some major European countries too. So again, there it's not quite clear whether it goes towards more European integration. There's also the risk of more European fragmentation. And now when you bring in the great powers, and I think it's really the interface of regional and global actors that's most decisive, you have a series of European strategic issues where they point to where we will be heading. One is the future of US leadership in NATO. It's really unclear at the moment. A second point is obviously the outcome of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. We see different signs of how the Europeans and Washington are working together or not. It changes a bit on a daily basis at the moment. And how this will play out is really quite decisive, both for Europe's order and for the global order. And then there is the question of whether the Europeans manage to really effectively move towards more European defense without alienating their electorates. This is a very thin rope to walk. And all these issues have different scenarios, how they play out. But I think it's on that level of question that we will find the markers where we will be going. And I'm not sure we will be completely beyond any liberal order. I mean, there are scenarios that, if you look at the Chinese, for example, they also do have some stake in parts of that previous order. So there can be more optimistic scenarios where elements of the previous order will be integrated into something new. It's just a bit too soon to tell how this will play out.
This is the challenge of living history as it happens. You can never tell which of the things that just happened was the actual tipping point until.
And the funny thing about this chapter is when I started to do the research on it, this was before Trump came in. And I think not many of us would have expected that scope of transformation happening in such a short amount of time. So even when devising the chapter, I had to adapt my thoughts, my analysis. It has been a bit of a moving target, but I think we now see a bit clearer where things could be going.
His administration has surely moved fast in implementing their priorities, and I think it's left allies and adversaries alike sort of on the back foot on how is this going to play out, which direction are we moving. And the tipping points thing, I think, is an interesting question, because that list that you had, the war in Ukraine, also the relationship with NATO, and then within Europe, some of the countries that are sort of thinking about a democratic backsliding, each one of those could really prove definitive for the future. And I think we're all going to be working very hard.
You redefine the transatlantic partnership. If you have this domestic change in perhaps France or Germany, and perhaps also some stronger links over the Atlantic, it would be still some sort of transatlantic alliance, but with a different sort of different ideas underpinning it. And it's not so easy to predict what this would mean then for the greater European security arena.
Right. Well, I fully expect you to come back again in 2 years, and then we can watch the one from before, and we can watch this one, and then we can look at the next one, see what happens. You talk in the chapter, too, about the role of middle powers, so I want to draw that out a little bit. You talk about a concert of powers or multipolar, but there's also so many other countries out there that play a huge role in shaping this international order. India's one, Switzerland's another. How do you see them and their role playing out?
I find actually these middle ground powers one of the most interesting actors of analysis in the current landscape that we observe, because they very skillfully navigate between the major power centers. And I think they play a seminal role in pushing us towards a world that's really multipolar, also a world that will be less Western dominated, less democratic, perhaps a little less globalized. They are transactional, but in a bit of a different way than the Trump administration. It's not so much about making deals, but about having the best of different worlds, really maximizing how they safeguard their interests and push their rise. I think it's all about securing their rise as powers. And Saudi Arabia, India, they're very, very successful at this. They also push, what is interesting, a lot of connectivity projects, interregional transport corridors, new infrastructure for globalization. There's a lot of trade within the South that they push. So I think that they actually play an important role in redesigning globalization. It will be less US dominated, less US driven. And how this will play out does have a seminal influence on how the future order will look like. I'm not sure Switzerland would be a middle ground power, but this is a domestic debate that I leave here for the moment.
I will not get in the middle of a domestic debate. Absolutely not.
I've heard a lot of pushbacks actually against the idea that Switzerland would be a small power simply because of its sheer economic power, of course, that would comfortably place it within the G20 sort of slate.
But it has a bit of a Western identity and it has a bit of a middle ground approach, so it's a bit of a mixture.
It's a bit of a mixture.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah, India, I think, is one of the most interesting, pivotal nations for the next decade. I mean, its sheer size, its economic power, and then, as we've seen just over the last week, an exchange of fire between two nuclear powers on the other side of the world still matters a lot. Everybody's been on the edge of their seat waiting to see how this plays out, and yet another potential peace agreement that the Trump administration is in the middle of. And India, I have always found them to be very unwilling to be ignored. They're going to speak up and they're going to say their piece, no matter who it aligns with. I find that trend sort of fascinating.
Yes, I mean, and structurally it's a fact that India and China combined, the rise of Asia seems a fact. It's a structural thing that's happening. The way how India does a lot of trade with Russia, is still a good ally with the US, tries to mend fences with China, does a lot of new stuff with the Gulf, Arab Gulf countries. I mean, they're very well positioned, and the rise will take a while in the sense that it's such a huge population, but it's going to be one of the most important developments in the years to come.
Yeah. All right, Gorana, let's talk about your chapter. And I love the title, Whither or Further, the Future of Euro-Atlantic Indo-Pacific Cooperation. It's very explicit about this connection that we were just discussing between Europe and Asia, transatlantic and trans-Pacific. It's one big globalized world out there, and you can no longer really think about the planet in different categories, different areas. So let's talk about the connections. How has Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine exposed both the strengths and limitations of European security cooperation, and then we'll flip over to Indo-Pacific and talk about what's happening there?
Well, very briefly, yes, I would say that this is a sort of natural segue as we start talking about the various middle ground powers that play pivotal roles and will decide where the world might be heading. But in terms of the European security cooperation, I would say if we just focus on the Euro-Atlantic area, the strengths have been mostly those that were not necessarily expected in the first moment. If we think about the unprecedented political unity and the sort of alignment that we saw right in the aftermath of February 24th of 2022, whether we are talking about the sanctions packages, aid to Ukraine in all sorts of manifestations, military, diplomatic, economic, and similar, as well as institutional agility, right? To think about the way that European Union has responded, repurposing certain instruments to actually provide military aid, such as through the European Peace Facility, or the way that NATO has enlarged and similar sort of discussions, right? Or the kind of very much overnight sort of realization that more needs to be done about defense industrial base and so on. So a lot of these things that we didn't necessarily expect would happen so quickly and so powerfully did. But on the other hand, in terms of exposing those weaknesses, I would say those are all the things that we could have expected, right? If we talk about, again, I've just mentioned the deficiency in the defense industrial base, still the kind of lacking investments that were there, right? And that needing to be really sort of jump-started, and the way that it's now going to be done, right? A lot of pledges were made around Zeitenwende, for instance, and so on in Germany. But, now kind of a lot of hopes for actually that to come true in a way that a lot of people expected, and for that to happen actually in a coordinated way and a joint way across Europe, especially, right? Where we wouldn't see necessarily duplications as before, and, again, kind of everyone sort of pulling in their own direction as were cases before, but also standard lines. I said, yes, there's been a lot of policy alignment, but for every one of those big news, there's also been a lot of, again, discoherence and sort of lack of cohesion on certain political issues, so political divergences, where certain countries would have wanted to kind of pull ahead, and really show that resolve in supporting Ukraine, and those were mainly the frontline states, right? Versus those, and that's also part of the territory of kind of strategic cacophony in terms of, Euro-Atlantic or European defense and security, where those who are maybe further removed from the immediacy of Russian threat were sort of those more of the slowing down kind of factors. And then, of course, again, for all the institutional agility, we always have the same sort of conversations of, if EU is to become a credible security actor, right? If it wants to be really a geopolitical actor, that it needs to reform, right? That some of these sort of simply procedural rules on unanimity, right, and consensus on foreign and security policy, that doesn't quite work when you have obstructionists from within the EU, right? And so the kind of pushes for qualified majority votes and so on have also gained steam, along with other things, again, on NATO front, seeking consensus among now 32 member states obviously makes that common denominator much lower and kind of lesser in ambition, I would say, in a lot of times, simply because you need to find that compromise. But then I would say if we extract ourselves a little bit from the Euro-Atlantic space in particular, I would say one of the notable developments, and this is sort of what I cover in my chapter as one part of the broader story of the Euro-Atlantic Indo-Pacific security cooperation, is really the deepening and strengthening of the security cooperation between various actors, whether they are nation states or organizations in the Euro-Atlantic with their counterparts in the Indo-Pacific, mainly states we are talking about, but not exclusively states, right? If we think about EU-ASEAN, right, that's also a relationship that's very much an inter-organizational, and that's very much, having the part of the agenda focusing on, say, maritime security. So we see some of these things actually really accelerating as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion and the ensuing war, obviously, in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. I for one, have, of course, been in contact with our European allies from throughout the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it started off with conversations that I was having with a partner across the Atlantic where they were saying, but your defense industrial base has all kinds of spare capacity. Why don't you wrap up? And us saying, we don't have, what are you talking about? You have spare capacity. Why don't you ramp up? And that has now matured, thankfully, and changed quite a bit. And I have been so impressed with the way that Europe has stepped up and united and done a ton of investment in defense, both for themselves and then also donations to Ukraine, selling things to Ukraine. As the Brits say, needs must. It's a moment, right, where there was really no choice. And as you said, the frontline states were the ones who first and foremost said, well, we know that we're next. I remember having a discussion with some of our colleagues in the Baltics and them saying, if they're coming, we're done. So we need to be ready no matter what happens. And it's just it's very real for them in a way that it wouldn't necessarily be on this side of the Atlantic, but we need to be there to support.
Sure.
I also, strategic cacophony, that's a great phrase. And that like conversation within Europe, I think, has definitely risen and fallen and sort of emerged to a place where there seems to be a lot of forward motion. Do you have hope that forward progress is going to continue?
Well, you have to have some hope, right? I mean, I think in our line of business where it's mostly doom and gloom these days, I think, again, I would go back to the fact that some of these things, if you think about just where we were prior to Ukraine, but even, just 5 years ago or so, we were talking about this idea of Westlessness. We talk about it again, right, in the context of the second Trump administration. But I do think that there are certain things that we could be hopeful about just simply because of the realization within Europe that if there ever was an hour of Europe, it's now, right?
Yeah,
We've had so many of these false starts, and I don't think that if this opportunity passes, right, and if there isn't really some major change that happens, that there is going to be a kind of next try, then it's going to be a lot of these sort of piecemeal, kind of fragmented efforts. We do see a bit of that already, in terms of the coalitions of the willing, right, and the kind of strengthening of these various nodal defense arrangements where certain countries are more willing. And again, I would go back to the fact that, of course, if your strategic calculus is one where you are sharing a border with Russia, you are going to be way more concerned about your military spending, your preparedness, right, your capabilities, than if you're on the Iberian Peninsula. It just comes part of the territory. I understand that, but we also need to understand that the nature of warfare these days is not simply kinetic, right, and that this is being fought on various other domains, whether it's cyber, whether it's in informational space, whether it's through the weaponization of economic sort of supply chains, right, lines of kind of exchange between countries. And here, if Europe doesn't work together, right, it's like the whole, if we don't hang together, we'll
hang separately.
Hang separately.
Yep.
So that full well. So in terms of that, there is that realization. I again see some positive developments now in terms of at least some of the bigger European states really trying to kind of find their ground, to kind of set the agenda on that, and really again we are living through it, and then. As you said, maybe ask me in 2 years what our sort of batting average was here in terms of what our expectations and maybe predictions were. And here maybe to say something again in terms of the strategic trends overall, I think this is not so much as of an exercise in forecasting, but basically providing different scenarios, because we are dealing with so much uncertainty these days. And what we really try to do with this publication is just to offer kind of the contours of the world that it is and where we might be going, right? What are some of these pivotal forces that are shaping it, and where we see there could be further progress, and where we see maybe things that have been in place not necessarily being seen through in the way that we've seen them.
And that's actually more helpful. I mean, I had a professor at UVA, Larry Sabato, who used to always say, he who lives by the crystal ball winds up eating ground glass. So a straight line prediction isn't going to really help anyone. And there's so much uncertainty, as you say, that any one of those things, if they went one direction or another, is going to change the landscape dramatically. So thinking through, how can you position yourself as a country, as a company, as a think tank, to be best positioned to really help what's going to happen in the future, no matter what scenario you're going through. And your point about the Russians not only fighting this as a kinetic war, my colleagues here at the Defense and Security Department have done some tremendous work on sabotage operations in Europe, and the Russians really are, putting a toe on the line and then pushing a little bit farther, and then putting a toe on the line and pushing it a little bit farther. And Europe, I think, has every reason to suspect that Russia is willing to continue that aggressive behavior, no matter which direction the peace discussions go with Ukraine. So I think it's a really critical point. Let's shift, though, and look at the Indo-Pacific and these ties between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. We have seen countries like South Korea step up and send a lot into the European theater. Japan is working within its constitution to do what it can do as well. And of course, the U.S. continues to try to build those alliances, mostly in a bilateral sense, but sort of toying with the idea of some multilateral operations as well. So how do you see the risks, the challenges to Euro-Pacific cooperation, and what do you see as the way ahead there?
Yeah, so what I did in my chapter and how I would frame this is that we need to think about the drivers that have been behind the increased cooperation, both in terms of the depth and the strength of these ties. And I basically talk about four different things. One being the increased European interest and engagement with the Indo-Pacific states, which basically started almost now a decade ago. So just a little bit under with these strategic articulations of basically different policies towards the Indo-Pacific. France was the first mover. It sees itself as a resident power, followed by Germany, the Netherlands, then EU, UK. Various players. We have now Sweden was the last one in that mix, but also Czechia, Lithuania, right? All of these countries in Europe have actually articulated their strategic sort of pronouncements regarding the Indo-Pacific. They have some form of either strategic guidelines or outright strategies for the Indo-Pacific. And here, if we think about that driver, where we might see some risks is primarily in what we talked just a moment ago, is that the focus is going to be on Europe and European defense for the foreseeable future. And this has only been made more stark, of course, by the recent moves of the Trump administration, where Europeans are now in this position where it is, again, all about defense and deterrence, and they need to build up that capability. They need to focus on the continent. So it is a question of which one of these states that still has interest, how much of the bandwidth will be left for the Indo-Pacific, right? And we could suspect actually that it's going to be probably the larger ones that are going to still have some sort of slack to do that in a way that they maybe plan to do it before February of 2022. Then on the second driver, I think in terms of this idea that there is the indivisibility of security, which was highlighted by Russia's war in Ukraine, right? That basically, I think that the strategic concept, NATO's strategic concept out of Madrid summit in 22 really put it very sort of succinctly and precisely that what happens in the Indo-Pacific affects Euro-Atlantic and vice versa, right? That this is not going to go away simply because we see now these interlocking relationships between Russia, China, North Korea, right? Iran to an extent. The fact that you have North Koreans fighting in the Kursk region, right on the border with Ukraine, just kind of makes that very sort of vivid, right? In terms of how the two theaters are connected, and the fact that then through different formats, for instance, within NATO Indo-Pacific 4, the IP4 format, South Korea, which you mentioned, of course, which has been a great sort of source of actually material with one of these landmark deals with Poland, right? That basically South Korea was able to set the agenda on North Korea, even at the level of the Atlantic Council, right? With North Atlantic Council within NATO. And that tells us something, right? That there is this sort of situational awareness of, again, what these things mean, because for sure Russia will have to give something back in turn for these 15,000 or so soldiers that the Kim regime has already sent onto the borders. So that's the second.
Space cooperation. Sure, that's one thing that we've seen. Space cooperation.
Sounds like missiles.
Right.
So on that point, in terms of, just the acuteness of the crisis at the moment, and if we do see more durable peace deal, whether that would be maybe a risk, whether the kind of, the moment of crisis passes and these interests are no longer there. But again, I would say a lot of the things, the cooperation that we see, especially Russia and China, right, that's going to remain. And for that reason, again, the Indo-Pacific US allies in particular, right, are going to have an interest in seeing how this reflects as well on the Euro-Atlantic, but also on the Indo-Pacific theater. And then I would say, so for those two factors, I would be more hopeful that there are reasons why we could see the continuation of cooperation. I had two other factors, which I think as drivers moving forward are going to be a little bit more kind of left aside, let's put it diplomatically at the moment, because one of them was really a kind of part and parcel of the Biden administration's alliance agenda. Mm-hmm. And we saw that, if you look at the strategic documents all the way from basically the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy to the national security strategy, national defense strategy, various other documents, and several different sort of policy entrepreneurs, from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of State to the Indo-Pacific czars, so to speak, who were all about bridging allies, right? This was a big sort of idea coming out of the Biden administration, which was actually quite counter to, say, the Obama administration's announcement of the pivot, right? Or the rebalance, exactly, right? Which basically sort of made it seem that there is this sort of zero sum, right? If we are pivoting to the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific back then, right, that this means that we will basically give less attention to the Euro-Atlantic. And with Biden, there was this idea, no, we can do both, right? Somehow, you know, this is part of the integrated deterrence as well, discussions, right? Allies need to actually work with each other. They shouldn't be siloed into regions again. And there was a lot more, I would say, really to their credit, the Biden administration really missed no opportunity to stress how important it is for NATO countries, for instance, to cooperate with the Indo-Pacific Forum, but in various other formats, right? And also, I mean, you know, if you think about AUKUS as one instance of that as well, in terms of the cross-regional ties, you know, throwing in the industrial defense partnerships and so on. So that's part of that story, which simply I actually don't see these days coming from the incumbent administration, that this is something that we will see kind of further developing. If anything, there were just recent news that actually some of the statements coming out of the Pentagon, for instance, were actually saying, no, for instance, UK should focus on Europe, right, rather than the Indo-Pacific. And, you know, I expect that there might be a lot more of that with this kind of idea of ruthless prioritizing of the Indo-Pacific. And then one final piece was that last driver, and that was a very ideological part of the values-driven cooperation, right? Democratic countries against authoritarian assertiveness, which these days, when we talk about, you know, democratic backsliding now being nearly 2 decades in this sort of making, I think we are just about to kind of reach that point where we see basically a steady rise of both hybrid or simply non-democratic regimes compared to democratic regimes, and with all of the kind of goings on, even here, right, where we see this assault on some of these basic values, or maybe just that rhetoric not being so prominent, that this won't be an organizing principle, and simply, you know, that idea, it wasn't just the, again, Biden era Summit for Democracy, which was also, you know, we can talk about the problems it had and who was invited, who wasn't, and so on. But, you know, it predates even that. There were ideas of building from G7 a D10, for instance, a Democracy 10, by inviting Australia or South Korea, India, right, or maybe even something broader than that. This was a UK initiative, and so on. I just don't see that at the moment, right? This is not sort of the language we are talking about. We are in a world that's much more comfortable now with the spheres of influence sort of jargons, right, rather than sort of let's band together because you know, we need to fight for liberal democracies, or those voices are, you know, now not necessarily as dominant as they were maybe just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trend line. And as a total democracy nerd, you know, I hate to see the trend away from talking about the importance of democratic institutions, the importance of a free and fair playing field for everybody to have a voice. Like, those are all things that just seem like universal values. But, you know, we'll see how this develops over the next few years. All right, I want to pivot now, not to Asia, but to digital capabilities, and talk about digital capabilities as a strategic resource. Myriam, this was your chapter, a weighty and timely topic, and I thought it was a really interesting read. You mentioned this growing technological imperative surrounding key digital capabilities like quantum computing, high-end semiconductors, secure and redundant data centers, contributing to a winner-takes-all environment. You have dominant states consolidating their control, and then you have exacerbated global inequalities. So talk a little bit about the implications of that. Which direction do you see this going, and how can small and medium-sized powers navigate that competitive landscape?
Thank you. I think what is really interesting is that, when you discussed with Dani and Gorana was this question of where's the trend, where it's headed. I see this one as, very little uncertain. I really believe that this is, something that we're in the middle of and we can't really go back on it. Why? Because technologies are, digital technologies, and others are obviously as well, but they're so deeply embedded into anything that we do that it's almost like a fuel to the strategic competition that we're seeing. So without thinking technologies, I don't believe we understand many of these other trends. And this technological imperative is actually a kind of like a companion to the security imperative that also is related to these technologies, and these two things become fused. So try and think security without technology nowadays, it's almost impossible. And a lot of the things you already touched upon, the defense developments, all these kind of things, again, technology is everywhere, digital technologies are everywhere. And the key thing to understand what they're doing is actually that they are translatable into power. They are a resource for shaping things, for shaping the future. I think this is another extremely important element here. And the ones that are winning, and these are the big powers, are obviously in the position to shape a lot of these developments going into the future that have a lot to do also with societal dimensions, economic dimensions, etc., etc. And the ones that are left behind, basically all the others, are scrambling now and try to find ways into this game, because it seems to be so fundamental for how society, the world is developing into the future. And the second question you asked is how can they do that? How can the ones that are not in the driver's seat, and those are many, what can they even do? And I think in the last, I would say, 1, 2, 3 years, there are, I would say, strategies now that these different powers see and try to kind of capitalize on. One of them is obviously finding the niches. We hear that also when we talk about semiconductors, etc. Understand the global supply chains, find where you're really good at, and really, kind of position yourself there. I think that's a must. So there are certain things that you cannot catch up on. So you need to find these very specific kind of things you want to be good at, but also where you want to invest in. That's one thing. The second is we can, I say we, the smaller powers, can also think in terms of coalitions and alliances in terms of technology. Obviously, there are, alliances also that go beyond the technological into the political, but through technologies. That's the second one. The third one that I find really important is the norms debates, that we have a feeling like almost like we cannot, talk about norms in this space. It's too quick. The developments are too fast. We cannot stem, these kind of developments, which I believe is a wrong kind of position. We still need to think about governance, what we want, what kind of world do we want to live in, shaped by technologies, and how can we make sure that these norms then, you said you're a democracy nerd, kind of align with, some of these fundamental values that we want to keep. And I think the fourth one is the question of talent, innovation, ecosystems, etc., which actually is quite at a loggerhead with this idea of security and, taking things closer to yourself, nationalism, tech nationalism, etc., where there's a huge tension at the moment in terms of knowledge, security, who gets access, how do we make sure we can be innovative and still kind of control these environments, etc. But without this, without thinking about talent, innovation, and how that relates to security, we will not be able, to walk into the future with any kind of confidence. So it's those four which have a huge also kind of interlinkage, with the strategic and security. And how to navigate that is an open question at the moment.
Yeah, so questions and certainty both in this one. I like what you said at the beginning about how there is a certain inevitability to the direction that we're marching and the linkage between technology and security. I think that's something that we have seen in stark relief on the battlefield in Ukraine. Yeah. It hasn't necessarily been about mass and traditional military capabilities. It's been about innovation. It's been about autonomy. It's been, how quickly can you churn out the next gen drone that's going to make a real impact on the battlefield. And related to that, your comment about norms and governance. We can't rush blindly into this space. We do have to think about what we want from this technology, not just where the technology can take us. On that note, you talked about, in your chapter, deepening societal polarization and how technology can lead to that kind of phenomenon too. And I think we've seen that here in the US for sure. It is astonishing to me how different the media bubbles are that people live in. I mean, even just watching the Trump inauguration, I flipped back and forth between several news networks that shall remain nameless, and it was like switching to a different planet as much as it was just watching the same thing happen at the same time, but just completely different commentary depending on which news outlet you were watching. And that was even more extreme on social media. So could you talk a little bit about the deepening societal polarization and what you see as the increasing divisions between the haves and the have-nots in this space?
It's the haves and have-nots, but also the do-not-wants. Because I do also believe that, it becomes a bit of a, do I want to be part of this world or do I not want to be part of this world? And I know that in the US, there are much more people who actually are really AI friendly or Gen AI friendly, whereas in Europe, for example, you see the opposite. There's a lot of mistrust, distrust. So that is a division. So who will be able to use these tools? Who will it benefit in the future? Who will actually be able to, turn this into something that they're a part of? So this is at the level of basically, the individual and how they use it. But you already mentioned it also, this uncertainties that the technology brings into a lot of our political space, because these technologies are also misused as tools. We see that obviously, with the whole debate about cyber warfare and now subversion, mistrust. There as well, you mentioned the media bubbles. How will we, be able to go away from polarized societies if we keep living in completely different bubbles, which we don't even understand our bubbles, and it's most likely that this will become worse in the future. So, do we understand what kind of information we get, that we don't get, etc.? On the political level, of course, you have the same phenomenon. So it's not only the society, but it's really also who is able to shape and use these technologies into the future. And then this is another polarization. The ones that are already wealthy will obviously be able to use them better than the ones who are not. We've seen that for a long time also in the use of data analytics, etc., etc. So a lot of the inequalities that we have that are economic in many parts, that will deepen and continue to grow going into the future of the digital world.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think AI is going to be a game changer in so many ways, and we need as a society to figure out how to manage it so that it is not just disadvantaging a whole group of people and advantaging a small group of people,
exactly.
But really is a technology that can raise all boats. Yeah.
And maybe if I may, because that's a thought I also had while Dani and Gorana talk, I think if you start focusing on technologies, you're bringing a different type of, I want to say political actor, and that's the private sector, who has become very political. And that is also really interesting if you think politics as a sort of governance or as a sort of, democratic game. How can we actually make sure that we work with these new type of powerful actors in ways that again kind of benefit society, if you so want, and kind of I want to say, how can we bind them in some ways to go forward together, because they obviously have different interests as well. And I think that's another part of this polarization or potential divide that we are seeing everywhere.
Yep, I was at the Hill and Valley Summit on Capitol Hill a few weeks ago, and a thing that started out as 30 people in a room 4 years ago, now had about 500 people in that room. And it really spoke to this increasing, cooperation and collaboration between government and industry, which is encouraging to see, but we need to do it thoughtfully in addition to with vigor. But I want to be sure that we get to Névine and her chapter as well in the few minutes that we have remaining. Also about advanced technologies, but a different lens, control and cooperation amid great power competition. So this is looking at technological rivalry, the restriction of access to critical technologies, people who are circumventing these restrictions, and then how allies can collaborate, but then there still are these high walls sometimes that make it difficult to collaborate. So tell us about the trend lines you're seeing in this space.
So my chapter identifies pretty much these two big trend lines, so technology control and technology cooperation, but also a third one, which is the impact these two have on the global south in particular. And so on the tech control, I think CSIS has done a lot of amazing work on this as well. But we've seen under the first Trump and the Biden administrations, just a lot of restrictions being placed on advanced semiconductors, but also transfers of dual-use items. And while these restrictions have targeted Russia and its use of Western technologies to fuel military aggression against Ukraine, it's been more importantly focused on China, given concerns of Chinese use of US technology. And because traditional multilateral export control regimes are quite ill-suited to address the goal of maintaining a technological leadership over China and to sort of block these, we've seen increased use of unilateral export controls by the US and when possible plurilateral controls, which have been more successful vis-a-vis Russia than vis-a-vis China because their US allies do have different goals. It's more difficult as well for US allies and partners to impose export controls outside the framework of multilateral regimes. This is slowly changing a little bit. We've seen developments like the Wassenaar -1 strategy, also at the EU level, better harmonization and coordination of unilateral controls, but at the same time also a changed US approach that's been more targeted toward preventing the re-export of US technology through third countries. And that's to a certain extent not always been very well coordinated with some allies in particular. And here I'm thinking of the AI diffusion framework, Biden's last measure in this space. On the tech cooperation side, which is the second trend I cover and mention, again, under Biden, we've really seen a change from the post-Cold War approach of the US of restricting sharing of advanced weapons and technologies to allies to what I think a lot of experts are calling selected or conditional proliferation to enable and arm allies to reinforce the overall deterrence capabilities of alliances. And here, a very good example is AUKUS, of course, both in terms of the Australian acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, but also the joint development of advanced technologies. And other examples include, for instance, the scrapping of certain restrictions on missile developments by allies such as South Korea and pushing for sales of US missiles to allies, which were previously perhaps under more scrutiny under the MTCR, the missile technology control regime. We're also seeing a lot more frameworks for cooperation for promoting joint innovation and dual-use tech, even some that existed under the first Trump administration, but a few of them, like the US-EU Trade Technology Council or the various working groups that exist on coordinating tech. There's a bit of uncertainty there regarding how they will continue.
This is something we hear a lot about from our industry partners as well, that they want to be able to collaborate industry to industry, but they have to go through so many regulations on both sides of the Atlantic sometimes that it can be very challenging to collaborate on pretty much anything. And so you see a lot of companies with subsidiaries in various places to try to work around however they can work around. And I swear I can't get 5 minutes into a conversation with most allies before somebody brings up ITAR, and also ITAR. So ITAR, yeah, I do think that there's a potential for reform there as well. So talk a little bit about the future of technological cooperation. If you could, wave a magic wand for a day and say, okay, here's how I'm going to make sure that we can both share the most important technologies and also keep things as secure as possible, or if there's like one or two things that you might change right away.
Oof, that's a difficult question. And I think it's quite difficult to do at the moment as well, given, I think, a lot of doubts that US allies have in terms of US security guarantees, because those also underpin a lot of the cooperation we see on technology, on advanced military technologies as well. So I would say perhaps the first thing is through reassurance again of allies within traditional alliance frameworks.
Always a good idea.
It does underpin a lot of these different frameworks we've seen over the last few years, and this goes back to Gorana's chapter a lot as well. In terms of what could be done, maybe on export controls and so on, there's a lot of forums that I think have been quite successful, but we've, even under Biden, seen difficulties in terms of coordinating with allies such as the Netherlands and Japan. And I think they're making use again of a lot of the frameworks that exist that are already in place, and not letting these go, and also trying not to divide and conquer allies, perhaps as has been done a little bit too much of in the last few months. Again, even under Biden, would, I think, prove to be a lot more useful.
Yep. Well, that's definitely a message that I would send to the current administration, that I understand the push towards America having more of a fair role in the world, and there being additional burden sharing between the U.S. and allies. But alliances are not just warm, fuzzy things to have sitting on a shelf. It's something that works hard for you over time. And looking at any alliance in a snapshot of a moment, maybe it doesn't look, quote, fair in that moment. But over the course of decades, that support, that alliance, that partnership really does pay dividends, whether it's technological cooperation or being able to span the globe with defense procedures, or even just share information about things like cybersecurity defense. There's all kinds of things that come from that strong transatlantic partnership that maybe you can't see on a spreadsheet or in a snapshot. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at in your chapter, that this is bigger than all of that. Donnie, I want to turn to you to see if you have any kind of closing thoughts. I really do appreciate this opportunity to have sister think tanks from across the Atlantic be able to sit down and talk about these big, sweeping issues from around the world. But you've put out this spectacular report. Anything in particular, if you wanted to give our audience a going away message?
Well, I think the main message is this is work in progress.
Yeah.
There's so much happening at the same time. It's a bit like pinball, flowing in all these different directions. But we appreciate the opportunities to exchange with other think tanks. This is why we have come to Washington. So thank you very much. And we hope that we can all continue to reflect on these trends, because it's quite important that we get these things right. So thank you very much from our side.
Yeah, thank you very much. We talk a lot about thought leadership, and while it's important to have individuals with great big visions out there, pushing the world forward, I think thought partnership is so much more important. And when you can sit down and you can, look at one topic from many different angles and really sort of test each other's assumptions, and as friends sort of push each other on, what are you assuming here and what are you thinking here? It's just so wonderful. And friends can be honest with each other. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.